luminous set of speakers who have had experience across industry, government, academia, and think tanks, and many of them across multiple of these fields, and who've all deeply engaged with research in their careers over the last few years and decades. We believe that today's session will provide many of us a very deep insight into how NRF is emerging, the history of NRF in the recent years, but most importantly, how we expect it to modify and change the research ecosystem in the country over the next few years. Let me introduce you to your panelists for today. Dr. Arvind Mitra is an honorary distinguished fellow at the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, and he had a long and illustrious career in government service across multiple departments, multiple science departments in the government of India, including senior leadership roles, and his last role was as the scientific secretary at the Office of PSA. He has a background in earth sciences and a very deep and accomplished research record. Dr. Naushad Forbes is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, a prominent industrial firm, and he's also the former president of CII. He engages deeply around science policy, has been publishing on this topic for the last several years, and wrote a wonderful book which had a detailed investigation into the Indian SAT ecosystem. We have Ms. Poona Mutreja, who's currently the executive director of the Population Foundation of India. And over a 40-year career, she's been a strong advocate for women's health, reproductive and sexual rights, and rural livelihoods. She has co-conceived several programs such as Main Kuch Bhi Kar Sakti Hu, A Woman Can Achieve Anything. And before joining the Population Foundation of India, she served as the India Country Director for the Rockefeller Foundation, for the MacArthur Foundation for 15 years, and co-founded and led the Ashoka Foundation, Dastkar, and the Society for Rural, Urban and Tribal Initiative. She's also a member of the Governing Council and Board of Action Aid International and the Lancet Commission, and has been a member of committees at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine at Washington, D.C. We have Dr. Udayan Ganguly, professor at IIT Bombay, and who's been deeply engaged with the development and the grooming of the Indian semiconductor manufacturing industry, working across and going across the aisle, working with government on developing programs and schemes. And a lot of the work that is happening in semiconductors has his contribution. And moderating today's session will be Professor Tarun Khanna, who's very well known in the science, technology, policy, and innovation ecosystems. He's the Jorge Paulo Leman Professor at the Harvard Business School and the first director of the Harvard's University-wide Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, which is co-hosting this session. A summary of his conceptual work on emerging markets appeared in a very well-known book called Winning in Emerging Markets. And he's a co-founder of Axelor, one of India's most active technology incubators, and of several technology and social ventures across emerging markets. So with that, I hand it over to Dr. Tarun Khanna to take this over. He has a brilliant panel. Professor Khanna, over to you.
Thank you, Mudit, and thank you to all my friends and colleagues for joining on the panel. We appreciate the time on behalf of FAST and the Mittal Institute at Harvard. I'll just make some introductory comments, and then the order ceremonies will be, we'll go around the panelists in the order that Mudit introduced them. I've asked them all to please make maybe 3 minutes each of opening comments. And then we'll just have a conversation. I'll moderate as best as my capabilities allow me to. And then hopefully there should be time for back and forth and some audience engagement. The chat function is enabled, and Mudit and the Mittal Institute team will be moderating it. So feel free to comment or post questions in chat as we go along, and somebody will summarize and communicate them to the panelists. Just a personal near history reminder to everybody. The discussion about what is now the Anusandhan NRF, National Research Foundation, has been going on for a long time. Those of us who are interested in science in general have been chomping at the bit to have something like it. and in proximate history, I remember back in 2014, 2015, which is not that long ago, but still seems really long sometimes when you're waiting for something to happen. In the context of a commission that I chaired on innovation and entrepreneurship, we had very active discussions. Wouldn't it be nice to have a National Research Foundation? And the context for that is sitting in the US, I'm acutely conscious that a good, 75%, call it that order of magnitude of funding that goes into the research ecosystem comes from the government, not from the private sector, and it's channeled through the National Science Foundation and other government bodies. So those of us who are fortunate to work in a vibrant research ecosystem, such as the one that I'm part of in Boston, realize the central importance of this to both foundational and applied or translational knowledge, and then the path through which it ends up triggering productive economic activity on the ground. And so this discussion has been going on at least since 2014, and many on the panel who are more distinguished than I have been discussing this a decade before that. So it's really nice to see, whatever its warts, that the NRF actually exists. I think that is a moment for celebration. And I'd like to strike a very positive and optimistic tone in this. Of course, there are problems with it, and we'll surface many of them as we go through. But it really is a moment to celebrate. So I hope we'll take a second for that. So that's all I'll say. And I'm going to go round right now and ask Aravinda, will you start us off since we're going in the order? Maybe
sure.
Your perspective.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you, and a very good evening and very good morning to all of you who have joined us today. So let me start with what Tarun said. It is really a celebratory, development, the setting up of the National Research Foundation. But I look at it as an evolutionary step. Having been involved in the research and development ecosystem across the government over the last, say, almost 36, 37 years, or maybe a little bit more, I have seen how the granting patterns or the granting methods in the system evolved from what we used to call the Science and Engineering Research Council in DST, which actually was the mother or the fountain of a grant-making process that started happening in R&D. That graduated into, not too long back, into Science and Engineering Research Board, sometimes around 2008 or something of that time. The Science and Engineering Research Board was established to be arm's length from the government, from the Department of Science and Technology, but it was also had a word N before it, and people tend to forget it, and that N stood for National SERV. But the issue that cropped up over the years is ultimately, in the parliamentary system of governance in the country, any such body is affiliated to a parent department, and that parent department then became the major controller for SERB, and to some extent, people thought the national character of SERB was lost, and it was a DST-driven organization. But there were certain features in SERB that made it possible for a department to be controlling it, but because of the involvement of finance people and others in SERB, which actually became a bit of a constraining feature for SERB. From SERB, we actually now graduated into NRF, and I just want to allude to the objects of the NRF for our discussions to be more clearer, to provide high-level strategic direction for research, innovation, and enterprise. So it has, for the first time, brought in the words innovation and enterprise into the funding realms of a national body like NRF. And also it talks of providing support to promote, monitor required for research in the country. And one great thing that it has also talked about is also to support research at the interface between natural sciences and society, something that was badly missing in the past. Certainly, people tend to compare NRF with NSF. There may be some similarities, but I feel, or having looked at the bill closely, the role of NRF seems to be much more multifaceted, in the sense that, there are three distinct elements that it has to fund. It has to fund research, it has to fund innovation, it has to fund enterprise, and therefore the grant-making model has to be very different. What will perhaps distinguish NRF from others is the effectiveness of grant-making process. Both the award, as I call it, pre-award, award, and post-award. The transparency in the system to eliminate redundancy, ease of doing science, and of course, a single platform it should provide so that it is a seamless method of applying and going through the entire process of grant making, grant execution, and then capturing the output matrix in the form of a data vertical that it is going to have. So in a way, it is a complete process in itself. But, there are certain issues that we need to discuss here. And one is, it talks about both inclusivity and excellence. And that is where I find a bit of a contradiction, because when you talk about supporting research in tier 3 institutions, there has to be some amount of, balancing act that needs to be done. That is one issue that we need to really discuss about. Then, of course, there are other issues as we discuss, we will come across, but I think this is a very critical factor, number one. And number two, while it does provide an assured grant of something like 14,000 crore over the year, in fact, it's just about 2,000 crores new money, 800 crores per month, around 2,800 crores per year, 2,000 crore from the new money, and 800 crores of the SERB. And aspires for a large grant coming from extraneous sources. So we have to put in place a mechanism to allow that. The bottom line here is what I feel is the operational mechanism of NRF. That is going to be most critical. How independent the CEO is, how much freedom the CEO is provided to have complete flexibility and nimbleness, and to what extent it really remains as arm's length from the government. I think that this is the bottom line. I think if this is properly handled, I think it is an exciting entity to look forward to work with. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Arvind, and thank you especially for the near history precursor to your comments, as well as a reminder that even though I alluded to NSF, that there are some significant differences. One of the issues, of course, that it raises, which will come up in the panel, is by trying to do everything, or trying to do three very different objectives with a frankly minuscule budget, is the experiment being contaminated in some ways? But we'll get to that, I'm sure. Naushad, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Tarun, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. My starting point is the same as yours, Tarun. I think this the NRF is potentially transformative for us as a country. And it's potentially transformative because of where we are as a country at present. And it's good to remind where we are. As a country, India spends about 0.05% of GDP on research done within the higher education system. That's against a world average of about 0.4%. In other words, we need to scale our investments in research done within the higher education system by a factor of 8 to match the rest of the world. And the reason we invest so little in research done within the higher education system is because of a choice we made decades ago to locate most of publicly funded R&D within autonomous government R&D labs instead of within the higher education system. It was a wrong call then, and it's remained a wrong call for now decades. I think the NRF is an opportunity to start to address that wrong call that we made decades ago. It's an opportunity to substantially increase the amount of research that happens within the higher education system. To give you just one data point, the entire amount of research done within the Indian higher education system, every university, IIT, IIM included, is less than the Stanford University, as one university spends on research each year. So we are talking of very different numbers. And I think anything that grows the amount of research done within the higher education system in the country can only be good. So that takes me to what I like about the NRF. The NRF specifies that the researchers who will be funded require an academic connection. Preferably, it should be an academic researcher, him or herself. And it says that a non-academic researcher, say in an autonomous government R&D lab, for example, cannot be funded unless they are partnering an academic researcher. That's a very essential condition, and it's something that we should ensure is not diluted in any way, shape, or form, because that's what will foster much greater research being done within the higher education system. The second thing that I like is that it says that both private and public R&D institutions, public and private higher education institutions are eligible for funding researchers who work at these institutions. Again, a big departure. It's something we take for granted for the US. Harvard and Stanford are private universities, but they get the great bulk of their research funding from institutions like the NSF or the National Institutes of Health. They're government funded mainly from their research efforts. In India, that's not the way it works. The bulk of government funding, even which goes to the higher education sector, is to public institutes. Very little goes to private institutes. So I think that's the second element that I like very much in the NRF and the way it's been set up. I have two things that I don't like about it. First is this idea that a 50,000 crore fund will be 1/3 funded by the government and 2/3 funded by industry. And I wonder where that 2/3 funding is actually going to come from. Indian industry needs to substantially increase its investment in in-house R&D. I mean, the multiples required are very similar to education. It's about 5 times for Indian industry to match the world in terms of in-house investment in R&D. That we should expect of Indian industry. But to expect Indian industry, which does not invest enough in in-house R&D, to suddenly turn around and substantially fund research done within the higher education system, I think is an unreasonable expectation, and it's setting up for failure. So I think it's an unrejoling pressure, etc., on Indian industry to contribute. There'll be a few big ticket announcements, etc. Will it be sustainable in the long run? I have doubts, and I hope that's something we can get into later on. The second concern I have is that it says that the NRF will be chaired by the Prime Minister, co-chaired by the Ministers for Education and Science and Technology. This might convey how importantly it's being taken. But think about it. For a country as complex and diverse as India, do you really expect the Prime Minister to be spending his time trying to figure out how we should be funding research? When we set up a construct like this, where you have something chaired by the Prime Minister, co-chaired by 2 ministers, it's actually a way of ensuring long-term bureaucratic control. And I worry about that. Because if you have long-term bureaucratic control, how will this end up being different from the way in which we fund most of our public R&D in the country today, with bureaucrats deciding which projects should be funded, which institutes should be funded, instead of leaving it to scientists to compete one with the other and get funding which is judged by their peers. So I think there are major potential areas where the NRF could truly transform the quality of research done within the higher education system. That could have many, many benefits, which we can talk about. I think there's some issues that we need to address as this program rolls out. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Naushad. That's particularly the view from your comparative perspective from the US and India is very helpful. I resonate with it, of course, both in spirit and in magnitude. And your dose of realism from corporate India is something I want to come back to in the course of the panel discussion, because we don't want to set up the NRF for failure for sure. That would not suit anybody. Poonam, may I request you next? Yeah.
Thanks, Tarun. I must say that the tone set by the two previous speakers is so encouraging that we are in the pursuit of excellence and transparency and setting up this institute truly for excellence. So I greatly learned and enjoyed the spirit. Agreeing with everything that has been said, the first question or comment I'd like to make is, if one were to evaluate the contribution of NRF at the end of 5 years, at the end of 10 years, what would success look like? Clearly, it cannot be on the basis of resource disbursement, which is a big role that this institute will play, this foundation will play. Tangible and measurable outcomes, indicators in terms of how people benefit, needs to be identified, going beyond accounting for inputs and outputs. I had the same reservation, first, the reservation money coming from industry that hasn't in India, especially invested in their own R&D adequately. But why is it that the government is not thinking, and especially given the heavyweight political stewardship, leadership that is being envisaged here, a large fund, if not in the beginning, but why isn't a large amount of funds, given the need and the priority being given, allocated or planned for or debated and discussed? Having said that, let me also say that any research in a country where we have the capacity, especially in social science, any further research, especially STEM, is absolutely welcome. And the fact that we're looking at innovations and enterprise along with research. But having been a donor, I'd like to say that I don't know the architecture fully, but I'm wondering what the architecture of doing these three areas, which are equally important, and innovation and enterprise must come out of research. How are they being planned? You need critically very different people to be looking at the various aspects. And as I read whatever little I read on NRF, there is also the potential to formulate policy, programming, etc., and benefit people in terms of services. And if you look at the science, the research, and the temperament in our both academic institutions, but especially in the lower STEAM schooling, I think we have to do not just high-end, but some back-end investments into a scientific temperament, education, awareness. In the areas of social development, technological innovations are important. Of course, they are important and they're necessary. But to the extent that they can improve efficiency, reach, very often we do produce the desired outcomes, but largely because technical solutions do not deal with the social determinants of the problems. And while I did see again that there is going to be an integration with social science, but there are a lot of other social factors, especially if I may spend half a minute on gender. On the demand side, those in position of decision making in the social sector have been reluctant, of course, to accept, I would acknowledge, findings of scientific studies, and that's another bridge we need to build. We don't seem to have a culture of decision making and public administration that seems to work with communities to understand local problems and so on. So all the downstream stuff, but very important stuff that Tarun and I have been working on in the Lancet Commission. So let me sum up by saying that the point I want to make is that stepping up investments in non-STEM and STEM research is equally important, especially in the areas of social development, and can definitely be a game changer in improving ordinary lives. So that's where I would focus on a lot. And I would say that given how social norms and the lack of freedoms women have, and many other areas as far as gender is concerned, that's something that we need to be aware, keep in our planning, thinking, and visioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonam. Poonam referenced the Lancet Citizens Commission that we're both part of, that's doing this research-centric study on trying to see how India can move towards universal healthcare. So that's the context that she was referring to. It's always excellent to hear you remind us of the social determinants that are really important to pay attention to for science and technology actually to have the positive effect that we would like it to have. And I loved your question of, maybe the panel can come back to it. What does success look like in 5 or some proximate horizon, 5 years, 10 years, pick a number. I would encourage people who are on the webinar to maybe answer Poonam's question in the chat as we go along. And Mudit and colleagues, request you to see if there's any summary of these that comes about and feed it back to the panel at the appropriate juncture that you deem fit. Let me ask Udayan. Udayan, would you comment? You're the closest to practicing research, at least in the pure sciences, as I understand, in one of my original disciplines in hardware engineering. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Tarun. Really appreciate this opportunity. I wanted to make 2 points, right? So the first one, and just to preface it, there's this book by Milan Kundera about this unbearable lightness of being, right? And there's a story about this peach tree, and there's this war that's coming, and this little gentleman sort of is really upset that the mother doesn't care about the peach tree. Mother doesn't care about the war, but instead just worries about the peach tree, and drives him insane, and then doesn't understand the mother. And then, 20 years later, the war is no longer there, and the peach tree is still in bloom, and the mother still talks about the peach tree. And so there are these longer timescales of science working, and that was an imagery that stuck with me. And one of the things that I've personally experienced is the whole semiconductors development in India. So today there are constantly people talking about, where are the new products? Where are the Indian versions of Intel? But if one does a historic study, 2006 nanoelectronic centers were built. It was a major change in the way funding was done. It was a lot of consolidated funding. Along with it, this Indian Nanoelectronics Users Program was built, which was supposed to bring in inclusiveness, right? So people from various places were brought in to work in these labs. From 2006, if you figured out how the publications worked, 2012, it took 6 years of incubation time for the first set of publications to come in. By 2016, India, the Indian publications in certain IEEE journals had beaten various countries and come to something like, between at least top 10, some places third highest number of publications just by volume, right? And so that was from 2006 to 2016, a 10-year time frame, right? So one of the things that Poonam talked about was evaluation, right? How do we evaluate things at such long time scales? That's one thing. The second thing is, in these time scales, I think infrastructure and consistent funding and consistent evaluation, which is very nuanced, matters, right? So this is the first point. So, I mean, history tells us that infrastructure funding is essential for growth in science over decades, and you cannot take shortcuts. The second point I wanted to make was also grounded from my semiconductor experience in this country. So right in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of policy, right? But there were very enlightened people who made some fantastic bets. And these bets have carried on. So while the policy piece is great, the people piece, what is of value, how do you evaluate, and going back to some sort of independent argumentation that is needed to put forth these nuanced policies, as opposed to trying to tabulate, quantize everything, right? So this is, to me, a significant challenge, and I don't know whether the policy addresses that, especially with a lot of centralization. So that's something I would like to hear more from others. So the second point that I had was that, where will the independent champions rise from? Who can actually make ground level changes based on their experiences. There are some interesting things in the policy about, indemnifying the NRF. So maybe that's something that goes towards that point. But that's a defensive position. I wonder whether there is more that is not said in the policy that maybe others who were in the framing of the policy, like Dr. Mitra, could comment on. So I'll pause here for others.
Great. Thank you, Udayan. The time horizon issue, of course, and consistency of support and funding and institutional rules and mechanisms. I mean, that's such an important thing. Thank you for reminding us of that. I didn't think we'd be discussing the unbearable likeness of being, but always happy to be reminded of that masterpiece. For those of you who missed that, it's by Milan Kundera. It's just a fabulous piece of writing that every educated person should skim, if I could be so bold. Yeah, in any case, by the way, one of the things that you said made me think about, I think Poonam's comment and also Arbinder's comment earlier about scientific literacy, right? I mean, the reason people are quick to say, where is India's, pick your company, Intel, as the case might be, even though Intel isn't having the best of times these days, but where is India's Intel is, I think we haven't cultivated the knowledge base amongst the citizenry, including amongst our industry stalwarts, as to how long it takes to do this. And that goes back to Naushad's point, right, that our industry simply doesn't do R&D. We just don't do it. I'm sorry, there's no other way to say it. And how are we going to get that changed? And I'll turn the screws on Naushad shortly during the panel and say, you ran CII, and my friend Dinesh is running CII right now from TVS. What are these guys doing to raise scientific temperament? Naushad, I'm reminded of a amusing and sad and sobering anecdote that I'll share just now. Speaking about CII, I think it was at one of your what do we call them? Partnership summits, right? Is that the one of those fancy events where, you know, people come and speak to lots of people in suits? And I was asked to do some kind of keynote for it. And I said I would do a conversation. So I was paired with Uday Kotak, who is much more eminent than me. And Uday and I decided we would just have a chat on stage. And in the chat, somehow the conversation shifted to, why are we not doing any genuine creation of intellectual property? And on the spur of the moment, I asked the audience, there must have been 100 eminent industrialists in the room. And I said, how many of you in the course of your professional existences have had a bona fide conversation with a real scientist in the last 12 months about your businesses? Naushad, what's your sense of what the answer was out of, say, 100 people? How many people raised their hands? Give me a number.
I mean, it depends a bit on the group, but I would guess 5.
That's a little bit of a heroic overestimate. It was 2, and both were connected to the pharma industry. And I then repeated the experiment at Harvard, and I asked our exec ed class, and the numbers there are close to between 40% and 65% on the low end. And that includes people making toothpaste, selling fast food, retail, things that you don't associate with science intensive, right? So the point that I was trying to make is that we really, I think the good news here is that we're starting so low in scientific literacy, even amongst the industries. And you go back to the objectives of the NRF, which Aurobindo highlighted up front. It's really interesting. It's so broad that I'm not quite sure. Maybe that's a good place for us to start. Let me open the discussion to the panel and say, what do we make of the objectives of the NRF, as Aurobindo highlighted these, which is to promote science. I may not say this literally correctly, to promote science, to promote universities, to have make sure that research has societal impact, etc. Anyone? We have a small group here, so you could, just raise your hand visually, and we can go from there. Now, Naushad has written in his op-eds that he's, as I remember, quite against this. He thinks it should be pure. But why don't you go ahead, Naushad? You can characterize your op-eds better than I can. So, go ahead.
Sure. So I mean, my starting point is the NRF should have a simple objective. The simple objective should be to fund and support academic researchers, full stop, and follow the bets of academic researchers. Let the academic researcher decide what project to do, how to do it, how much it takes, and then compete with other academic researchers to get funded. And one would want over time to see a real competition develop. I think Udayan will confirm this. But if you're a professor at an IIT, today it's very easy to get funded for academic research. I think the actual funding ratio is significantly higher than it is at most US universities. How come? It's because there's relatively little that goes on in the way of R&D within the higher education system in India. And if you go below the IITs, IISERs, maybe a few IIITs, the ISC, of course, Indian Institute of Science, of course, you go beyond maybe the NIT, and research tends to kind of vanish. And that's what we need to foster. We need to foster a much deeper academic research ecosystem in the country. And that should be the goal of the NRF.
Udayan, you just got cold called implicitly. Do you want to comment on what Naushad is saying?
Yeah, I think Naushad made a great point. So, one of the things that IITs need to survive is a pool of talent rising up through the ranks.
Yeah.
Right. And so I definitely think that if a Jadavpur University or a NIT Trichy has a robust educational program with significant amount of experimental work, right? Where, theory meets, practice meets, your mental models, right? I think a lot of interesting core development can happen, right? And that would probably include things like language, because this overemphasis on mathematics literally causes people to not understand diagrams or written nuances. So I definitely agree with Naushad on that. It's a fundamental challenge for us. But the other side is that even if you look at the fundings in IITs, is it enough? Should we do more? And the answer is that I think there are challenges. For every dollar that you spend in IIT, the level of infrastructure friction that we get, for example, foreign equipment, foreign supplies, untrained, workers, lack of spares, right? We are literally working, doing each aspect, from the technician's job all the way to doing science. So I think we typically, $1 probably goes, much less of a distance in India in any case. So that's one thing. The second thing I think is that if you are to build an integrated research facility, right, and you cannot put it everywhere, you should come up with a hub and spoke model, right? There are some good examples of that. As I talked about the nanoelectronics facilities, there are those which have these spokes. So there is a nuanced way to do this, I think. And as practitioners, I think we have sort of come up with some sense where it's a win-win. But more needs to be done at different levels. So I would pause here, and I hope I've answered some of the questions that Naushad has posed.
Okay.
If I may come in, Tarun.
Yeah, please go ahead.
As I said, my initial remarks, it's a fine balance between excellence and inclusivity. Both are important for us. We have to nurture our 2-tier, 3-tier institutions. And if we look at them very closely, we'll find out what is happening in these institutions, which do not have even the basic facilities that are required for, doing research. Leave aside the teaching facilities. So I think one of the best ways to do that is perhaps a partnership or a collaborative model, where, as Naushad alluded to, if you give grant to a national institution, it should have an academic partner. But I would put it the other way around, that all projects that we fund here in NRF should have a partner coming from a 2-tier, 3-tier institution. That would really provide the type of hand-holding that is required for them to get exposed to some of our best institutions, both nationally and internationally, through this process, rather than try to create infrastructure in these institutions. My own personal experience, having worked in DST for long, grants provided to universities, mostly remain unutilized. And the PI would say that, my Bata shoes were all gone, running between, the Vice Chancellor's office and the college office to get the grant released from the university to the college where he or she is working. So, those are facts that we should remember. But at the same time, it is important in order to spread the spectrum of the research ecosystem in the country, we need to onboard them. One thing that really is of a concern here for us is to push of the present government, which is correct, to really create knowledge convergence to build these technology platforms for better citizen delivery. And it is now expected that science and technology is going to play a very important and critical role. I would say almost a centerpiece in the in the socioeconomic growth of the country. And the aspirations of the citizen and the polity from our researchers have changed dramatically, and they actually look up to the scientists for providing solutions, be it energy, water. Today, you know, with the heavy rains that are happening, the disasters that is going on, the energy crisis, food crisis, health crisis, cybersecurity, manufacturing, everywhere I think scientists and technologists are called for. So what basically one is looking at is the tangible outcome from the research that we are doing. It is important for us to fund blue sky research or curiosity-driven research. Some of people also have gone forward to say as useless research, which I don't think it's extending things beyond a certain point. But I think it's important for us perhaps to look at the funding model in NRF based on a TRL pattern. Maybe TRL 1 to 3 is what we call the basic and fundamental, and the knowledge creation is so critical. And in the COVID time, we saw we were able to do the innovations because we had this knowledge, inherent knowledge in our system, and that is why the labs could come forward together along with industry and startups. But the point, what is important here is the innovation and entrepreneurship part is equally important in today's socioeconomic context. And I think, therefore, we have to create a mechanism in NRF where this transition happens. And my idea is, as we grow up the TRL ladder, perhaps the NRF funding should go down and the private sector funding should automatically come. So we should create a recipe for that, which is not existing in the system. What are the various models? How do we first define a TRL in the Indian context? What are the various models of funding? How do we share an IP in this whole chain of moving from TRL 1 to wherever 9 or whatever it is? So that is going to be very critical. I think that is something that we need to look at. And the second part is very critical. For the first time, a government entity which has got the flexibility to receive extraneous funds. Now, it's not only private sector, it doesn't say from where the fund is coming. It could be philanthropy, it is CSR fund. It is mentioned somewhere about CSR fund. It also talks about fund coming from public sector units. So I think this is a new window, and therefore we have to put in mechanisms in place to allow that to happen, and the flexibility in the system not to be governed by so-called GOI rules for every penny that is coming out from outside. So there is a window of 2 years. Udayan was asking me whether there is a mechanism. There is a window of 2 years to come out with rules and regulations that helps him to do that. And that has to be efficiently and effectively brought into the first 2 years. And the government, the bill says that the government will consider it. I think this is very, very critical. Otherwise, in years to come, we will, as we have seen in SIR, we completely engrossed into the GFR and government rule. And at the same time, it also says that it is open to CAG, audits.
Aurobindo, can I interrupt for a second? You have said GRF, CAG, TRL. I think you should educate the audience, which is the general audience, to what does that stand for.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the scientists are used to, using too many acronyms to speak. Yeah, so TRL is the technology readiness level, how knowledge is really converted into its application through a process of funding. So this is actually a model given by DARPA, which is the Defense Funding Agency. And GFR is the government financial rules. Any penny that you spend of public money is subject to GFR. And an institution which is created under the Government Act is subject to GFR. And CAG is the Central, Auditor General's Office, and that goes. The CAG works as per the GFR rules. And when we had approached CAG for flexibility in the system for science funding, they obviously said you change the GFR, and we have no problems in that. So I think here it is where it is the first 2 years we have to frame the rules and regulations, which has to be brought up appropriately into the system to provide this flexibility and nimbleness, without which it won't be able to meet its aspirations or the wide goals that it has to cater to. And one last point I would also say, besides promoting excellence in science, it also says the NRF should specifically focus on national priorities, on the frontiers of science, and on strategic research. Now, this is important. So far, most of our funding bodies have been funding non-strategic research, and the strategic domain has been kept out from our so-called funding agency. The strategic research is done by the atomic energy, space, and defense. So this is a bit of a contradiction, and in a way, how really we also cover this aspect is something that we need to look into. And when it talks of national priority, it talks of multidisciplinary, multi-institutional project to provide solutions on a priority or a timeline basis, which basically fundamental research will not be able to do because the timelines are long. So we have to put all these mechanisms in place, which doesn't seem to exist in the government system so far, to the best of my knowledge.
That's very helpful intervention, notwithstanding the acronyms, that there are these constraints within which we have to navigate. The constraints are all, as an academic would say, all endogenous. They're all created by our past practices. And so it's something that is quite amenable to change. Poonam, I want to direct a comment in the Q&A to you. It says, I'll just read it out. The government only focuses on STEM through the NRF. What about the humanities courses? Don't they deserve funding and research? And social sciences shrinking, etc. This is picking up on a comment that you made, which is at the end of the day, for science and technology to affect society the way the NRF wishes to do, there has to be some attention to the lived reality of people or industrialists or entrepreneurs or what have you. And, not to create artificial tensions, but that sometimes sits in tension with funding pure science, shall we say, or pure research. I know Naushad didn't say that we should only fund science. He said we should fund academics primarily, which is really quite distinct. But I'm reminded also that Dr. Rao, one of our eminent academics who is the director of one of the big IITs, I forget whether it's Mumbai or Delhi, had an op-ed that basically said everything should be connected to practice. There should always be a question posed by practice, which drives research. A statement with which I generally agree, though I think that there's much contestation around that. But Poonam, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so social science research was the issue that I was going to actually bring up in whatever you asked me, Tarun. I was going to bring that up in the second question.
I know that, yes.
And that is, let me start with the statement that scientific research, STEM research is necessary, but not sufficient. And given the state of social science research, all the comments that have been made by Dr. Forbes and others, we could apply that to much more and as much to social science research. And our literacy in terms of research capability and social issues, it's not just scientific literacy, but social literacy is also very poor. All of us have hired PhDs or worked with PhDs from India who, you're very surprised at the end of the day, did they even learn the research methodology, leave alone our capability of writing? And which is a huge problem where it comes to social science research and it comes to any form of research. So investments, I'm hoping that this is not only about STEM, that the political commitment is going to be there to support social science research, which has actually had always been underfunded. Tata Research Institute and Tata Trust and so on were investing, but it's few and far in between. And much of the research in social science, the money was coming from international donors, which is unacceptable and a pity and a reflection on our own CSR and government lack of support for budgets for and priority for social science research. and the international funding that was coming in is going to be hugely problematic because of the new laws that have come in. And I refer to the 2020 FCRA Act, where you can spend only 20% of administrative budgets, which includes the cost, the salary paid to a researcher. So you are not going to be able to use much international money from donors for research in India. I don't know if your institute, Dr. Mitra, your center is going to have exemption from FCRA, but the minute you get international funding from donors, you will also face the same problem that social science research and people who are not who are in autonomous institutions are facing, which is that you will not be able to give that money to anybody. You will not be able to re-grant it. And in fact, this has impacted social science research. You're talking about collaboration in a big way, where if you get foreign funding today, you cannot partner with another institute. And Tarun, you will remember we had this challenge in there too. But I also want to come to the fact that let's look at current institutions that work in India and internationally. Let's look at, I've been associated with demographic research a lot, and the fantastic International Institute for Population and Science. And we have the minister chairing the board. I'm on the board. And we spend all our time approving whether honestly, a Karamchari to a junior researcher to a senior researcher, we spend so much time discussing the processes. And I'm just giving this as one example, but I really think it's important to see what are the challenges the current research institutes, and especially the social science research institutes, are facing, both from your point of view, also people doing scientific research, institutions doing scientific research, and see what works and what doesn't work. But also when I hear that there is funding for IIT professors, more likely that they will have funding than outside. Even when I was a donor, if you look at the other donors and the grants that we were making for research, there was always a paucity of research across in India. And I am very worried about social science research, is my final answer to your question, not just the quantum of funding, but also the mechanisms. And also when we are thinking of this center, the kind of government controls that are going to could tie you, Dr. Mitra, your hands and feet, if I may be bold enough to say, or challenging enough to say, but also wherever in social science politics have come in, or politicians have come in, and I've seen that in the institutes that I'm associated with, autonomous government institutions, there are more challenges thereafter. So what is the room to change and
Poonam, let me interrupt for a second, if I may, with your indulgence. We'll come to the structure and the governance of whatever has been set up.
Sorry.
As a point of description, I do remember a version of the bill that I saw listed, the Prime Minister shall chair, the various ministers shall be vice chairs. There'll be a bunch of secretaries of different important ministries, and then so many from industry, so many from the sciences, and I think it said one from humanities. Yes. So there is a representation, but the numbers themselves are informative about the stated intent of the committee. I'll leave it at that. I see. I'm going to take the questions that are coming up in the chat. There are a whole bunch now, which is great. There's one to Udayan, which I'll pose to you. There's one to Naushad. Udayan, the first one says that he's worrying about career concerns of PhD researchers. it doesn't quite say scientists, it just says post-PhDs. There's not much opportunity for career progression. And therefore, that whole pipeline that you were alluding to, that the IITs and everybody needs a pipeline of talent to bubble up, so to speak, through some kind of ideally meritocratic process. Any comment on that from your experiences? You've been exposed to career trajectories at Cornell and thereafter in the US and then and now in India also. So maybe you have a view as a practicing researcher in India.
Yeah. So Tarun, I think there's a very interesting sort of dilemma among academics, right? And the dilemma is that for engineers, for example, right, there are certain engineering questions to be asked and to answer in a reasonable manner, right? And those who are doing that, there is, and it's hard to ask those questions, even to know what those questions are, by the way. So you have to know the industry, you have to have that connection to be relevant. On the other hand, there is this whole push to do publications which are very speculative, right? And you can see that it's not difficult to do that, right? Now, at the end of this, the question is, what did we learn from your thesis, right? And that becomes a challenge for companies to evaluate. Now, anyway, the kind of jobs that exist in India, as it was very clearly established that, Indian companies don't do research, right, in a significant manner. So a lot of my students and the students from IITs, they get hired into Taiwanese companies or to global companies, and they are fine because they have answered hard questions. But on the other hand, the connect with the industry, the connect with answering the right questions, the network, being poor in India compared to somewhere in the West, I think that does pose a challenge of what is even a relevant question to ask in the engineering spaces.
So let me turn to Naushad. Naushad, that's the other comment in the Q&A, right? Which goes back to the introductory comments that you made almost an hour ago, and that I was trying to amplify. What is it that we can do practically to get some subset of industry engaged so that this connect that Udayan is talking about can somehow be fashioned in a proximate time horizon, let's say 5 years?
So, first of all, it's not that Indian industry doesn't do R&D. Enough Indian industry doesn't do R&D, and enough of Indian industry doesn't do enough of R&D. So if you look at individual companies, there are examples of companies that do enough R&D. The pharmaceutical sector, it's no coincidence that the two people that put their hands up are from the pharmaceutical sector. The pharmaceutical sector is the most R&D intensive in India. It accounts for around 40% of total in industrial R&D in India, a higher share than in most other countries. And that's really a reflection of how other industries actually invest too little. The auto industry, to some extent, invests a few companies anyway. So there are companies that do. The companies that do are the ones that are interested in knowing what's going on in academia and in academic institutions, what kind of research is going on in those institutions. So I think it's a precondition. So to have companies that do a lot, like I'll tell you, we benefit as a company greatly from the fact that we've been reasonably R&D intensive for many years. As a result, we benefit greatly because we're one of relatively few engineering companies that do a fair amount of R&D. So we benefit greatly from connecting with IIT Bombay, with Indian Institute of Science, with IIT Madras, with IIT Bhubaneswar now. These are great connections. We find them very valuable and useful for the work that we do. And we're very happy to sponsor research in those institutes as well, because it's directly connected with our areas of interest. So I think we have to come at this from two ends. First, we need to see a lot more R&D going on in industry, and that'll create a receptive place for industry to engage with the research being done within academia. And second, we need to get a lot more of research going on within academia, the point that we've been talking about earlier on too. And so to get a lot more of research going on in academia it seems to me, should be the goal of NRF. And if we get enough of research going on in academia, including social science research, including STEM research, where the individual researcher decides, there was this point about useful, useless. I don't think any researcher sets out to do useless research. They may end up there, but they don't start off there. They all start off with some application in mind, with some idea of how the research they're doing is going to be so important to humanity. And that's what we should back. Whether it's is the second order question. So we first back them in terms of their own instincts. And then if they do something that's really productive and useful, it's up to industry to connect and turn it into something really useful that shows up in the innovation ecosystem. That's not the researcher's job.
Terrific. Several comments in the chat about expressing skepticism that industry is going to contribute I think, Aurobindo, you said, if I remember the numbers correctly, 2,800 crores, 800 crores is from existing corpus and 2,000 is to be raised from industry and philanthropy and so on. Is that correct or no?
Much more. Much more.
No,
2,800 from the government and 7,000 from industry.
I see, 7,000.
Yeah.
So what happens if I read between the lines of the comments on the chat and the Q&A and listen to Naushad's view on not enough people in industry do R&D, and those who are doing it don't do enough of it, etc. What happens if this 7,000 crores doesn't show up for the first several years? Dr. Rao, the gentleman I alluded to before, I'm just remembering his op-ed, I think he said, it's not going to happen unless you mandate it. That seems to be the favorite thing that everybody says. You got to mandate CSR to go to their pet clause. And my question to all of you is, how realistic is that? If you start mandating everything, what happens if that doesn't? Are we setting up NRF for a problem? Or whether I'm directing it to you, it's not an easy question.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer, but at least, we make a beginning to create a platform that enables it to happen, which was not existing in the government.
Yes.
So even when I set up, and Naushad is aware of it, the Global Innovation Technology Alliance, which was largely to fund, industry-led projects, or when we were working with the Israel Fund, which is a 40 million fund, we could not directly pay to the industry. The money had to be routed through an academic institution, which had to be a partner. So we don't have mechanisms in place yet to handle this. And I think it is important that, before we do this, there needs to be a stakeholder consultation. At times, all these decisions are taken 8,000 feet above or 8,000 meters above the sky, but without actually looking at the ground reality. So anything that we do where we have these multiple stakeholders, it is important for NRF and for us at this point of time to sit together and discuss what is viable, what is not viable, so that there is a clarity. And on that basis, we roll out schemes and programs. Otherwise, this is going to be a non-starter. That is very, very critical, number one. Number two, it has to get complete freedom from getting shackled by the GFR rules, which is again telling again and again, because it has to have its own operative mechanisms in place. Otherwise, it will lead into all types of audit objections and vigilance issues. This should have a capacity to handle that fund, which is very important. And it's not a fund only from industry. This is a fund also from philanthropy. It could come from CSR, from other international donors. The question of FCRA was raised. Now, it is also a stumbling block. Of course, the bill doesn't talk about it's getting an FCRA exemption. But yes, we have to apply and get that. But even if we get that, as you said, as Poonam rightly said, there are constraints in that. So all these issues first need to be discussed and worked out there. There is a provision to get exemptions. I think we must work on this assiduously in a time-bound manner to make sure that what we aspire. And this all stems out from the fact that the government has been aspiring to have 2% of the GDP as a part of the R&D funding, and there have been always discourse that, the industry funding should double up, and they hope through the NRF process, they will make that happen. But it doesn't happen like that. It is not a magic wand. You have to create the right platform for that. I think that is very, very critical and important as we start NRF. And that is how I think it could start, besides, of course, the government funding. I believe there is 1,000 crore that has been earmarked also, what is called an innovation fund. It's called, a special fund has been earmarked in that, which is meant for, innovation. And I expect that fund will have a strong contribution or a partnership with industry and enterprises. So the operative model of that fund also needs to be worked out. It is called, it's called a special purpose. It is called an innovation fund. There are actually 4 fund heads that have been broadly defined. One is the NRF fund for supporting the NRF, its infrastructure, running salary. Innovation fund is the fund that I talked about, which is to help, enterprises and translation to happen. And there is a science and engineering research fund, which will support the basic and fundamental research in science, engineering, and social sciences. And there is one special purposes fund. I'm not very clear what that means. So these have all been put in. What is good is that the bill contains all these things, and therefore it gives you the ability to work across all the stakeholders. But the point is, we need to first talk to the stakeholders before we really embark on any particular program, which is going to be very, very critical, rather than, announcing programs in a unilateral manner, which is going to be, that is going to be problematic for the entity.
So thank you for that. I'm just reading the Q&A. I'd encourage the panelists to look at the questions on the Q&A themselves and see if there's something you wish to address. There are 2 that stick out to me. It's quite vibrant in the Q&A, so please skim it. 2 questions that I wanted to direct attention to, both in different ways, ask about what is it that we are funding? What is it that the NRF would fund? One question suggests that we should start with, I forget the terminology used, priority areas for the country that identify some broad areas and so on and so forth. And I highlight that because that is always a tension point, right? Do you leave academics free to pursue their own volition and do their most creative work? Or do you put these buckets up front and say, now we're going to emphasize whatever the topic du jour is? It was pandemics a little while back. It's the energy transition today. It's cyber yesterday. And try to channel what is ultimately limited monies into predefined buckets. So that's one issue that I'd put on the table. And the second has to do with, can we say a little bit about interdisciplinary research? And the reason that might be of interest is the extent to which most universities around the world, including, by the way, my own here at Harvard, are incredibly siloed, right? Because in general, the academy promotes specialization. And by definition, that seems to undercut collaboration across the board. So we go through Herculean effort, Harvard. I'm sure that's true for all the leading universities, to find ways to bring people together. And it's a work in progress, and dare I say, a Sisyphean task. So any comments on the interdisciplinarity or possibility thereof, or on the idea of targeting research areas up front? Are arguments for or against this? Naushad, you want to go first?
Yeah. First, in terms of targeting, there is nothing that I think we should look at what the NSF model. The NSF, in a sense, has areas. It has groups directorates that are focused on a particular broad area of work, and then it funds researchers in those broad areas of work. And I believe the NRF wants to set up the similar mechanisms where you would have divisions or directorates that would also be around particular areas of work. That is just fine, right? So that will give you, if by strategic choices you mean that, I'm fine with it, right? But it should stop at that level of defining a broad area. then it's up to the individual researcher to come up with proposals that they make to those directorates. And those proposals have to be judged only by peers. They have to be judged by other academic researchers who decide that this is a good idea, this is a good area to research, let's fund it. There should be no government involvement in deciding whether it's worth funding a particular research proposal or not. If that's the way to ensure high quality. So I think if we target to the extent of having broad areas defined, and then leave it to individual proposals that are judged on the basis of peer review, that's just fine. In terms of interdisciplinary research, a friend of mine who used to be the president of a US university used to say that getting his academics to do anything was like trying to herd cats. And there's only one way in which you can herd cats, which is you have to move the food. So if you want interdisciplinary research done, fund it liberally. And define particular interdisciplinary problems, fund it liberally, and you'll get interdisciplinary responses.
So, Udayan, do you want to make a quick comment? Because there are about 7 or 8, shall we say, informed, prominent participants who are in the audience who would like to say something. But go ahead, Udayan, quick comment.
Yeah. So very quickly, I really like the DARPA model where you actually get an eminent academic to run a program and make bets. Now, I really like the idea of betting on individuals and then seeing what they do for a while and then see excellence grow. And I'm wondering, maybe that is something that this model has, because the other is this sort of, lack of faith-based, please give us projects. We'll look at every project and we'll give you some feedback, right? A very passive approach to things. And I don't know whether that really pushes things to the next level, right? So I would pause here and maybe others can comment. And I'm wondering if there is some mechanism of that.
Okay, I like that characterization as something for us all to think about, which is a passive approach for the NRF in allocating monies versus a more active approach. That's something that the committee can debate. When I say committee, I mean whoever the people are who are charged with this. I'm going to call on some people in the audience. Vijay Chandru, you wanted to say something? I believe you're unmuted. Vijay is a professor at Indian Institute of Science and an entrepreneur. Are you on? Yeah, we can hear you.
I'm not sure I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible. Go ahead. Go ahead, Chandra.
Okay, great. Yeah, sure. Actually, I had posed the question that I think Professor Ganguly just alluded to the DARPA model. And, one challenge that we've had with funding in India, I think, is in some sense the quality of peer review. And I've said this before in other fora, and I think so I'm a little unsure that peer review is the best model, and that's why I suggested the DARPA kind of approach. But of course, I think that does require a new type of program managers to step forward. I think the traditional sort of science bureaucrat, I'm not sure can deliver on that, right? I just is one perspective that, and so we need to think how NRF can be administered differently, right? If that's possible, if that's within the charter, that would be very helpful.
That's a very interesting point, Chandru. Thank you for that. We have a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Which is to get interesting peer review, we need many more people involved in research. But to get that to happen, we need good peer review done by researchers. So how do we cut through this conundrum? It's doable, but it requires a different model that Chandru was just alluding to. I'm going to just call on a few people that my colleagues are emailing me about who are in the audience, and just invite them to say anything in no particular order. Dr. Wadia from Observer Science Foundation, my colleague Vijay Raghavan, former PSA, of course, Professor Nag formerly from IM or at IM and former dean, Dr. Wadia from KEM. Any of you would like to say anything? Please, I believe you're unmuted. Welcome your reaction to the panelists. I'm also conscious we're rapidly approaching end of time, but let me just wait 10 seconds and see if anyone responds to that.
Hi, this is Vijay. Can I come in?
Yeah, Vijay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Please.
So I think this has been an excellent panel. Congratulations to everyone. It's been very, very useful. One important point is that, we need to move from, importantly, analyzing what the potential problems are and, how they are huge or tractable or intractable, to go on to how do we plan to deal with that? Because, the act is done, the NRF has been gazetted, so we have to get on to doing it. One major component is, if you compare it, even though the budget is small compared to the NSF, if you compare the size of the mandate with the current staffing which has been provided, the staffing is minuscule compared to the range of things to be done. So one important parameter which the NRF should get going and can do is to have on contract a whole range of experts across all divisions, from humanities to astronomy and everything in between, from the public, who can work at their sites or to become seconded to the NRF for short periods. That's something which will get great expertise. And these experts should come from industry and academia, reviewing projects, serving on the program division, and so on and so forth. And this distributed way of functioning in today's electronic world is something which is feasible. So that's very, very important. The second challenge is really in becoming efficient in dealing with state universities. Now, if you look at a map of India, and you map our CSR, DST, DRDO, ICMR, all the laboratories, it's densely packed from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. And also if you map our IITs and central universities. So in other words, these top laboratories, already well equipped, are just a stone's throw away from the state universities and colleges where we want to instill research. And therefore, a partnership can stave off the challenge of huge infrastructure requirements. If this infrastructure is opened up, the intellectual capital is opened up. This partnership is so important, and that too needs to be put in place. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Vijay, those are very, both these, Udyan's comment about activist versus passive approach, Chandru's comment about the chicken and egg problem and a different way to get around the quality of peer review. I'm taking notes. They're all intensely practical suggestions that are worthy of a call by whatever the committee is that is entrusted with this in the days forward. Let me wait a second and see if there's anybody else from the list that I just called on to who wishes to say anything. Feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I'm going to go to the panelists for summary comments in a moment. Okay, let's do a round. I'm going to go in no particular order. Who wants to start first? We need basically a 1-minute summary comment, or less than a minute.
So just if I can pitch in, Tarun, one
Yes.
great thing about NRF, perhaps many of you may not be aware of, is having the data vertical, which is a vertical that will be responsible for metadata collection, research output collection, connections, and so on and so forth. I think it is very important for a country like India to have this data repository, which is functioning, which is timely. in order to help in policy planning and future advice to the government. So this is a unique role which NRF has, and being a national research foundation, it should be able to collect and collate data from across academia, industries, and so on and so forth, which is involved in research and development, and should be able to provide policy perspectives or guidelines to the government. Having said that, I have one more.
Aurobindo, 10 seconds.
Yes, so that's very critical. One more thing that the NRF needs to work in a more proactive way is to engage with the line ministries. Today, you see the telecom ministry is funding 5G, 6G. MeitY is funding semiconductor. The health research is doing health funding. Women in Science looks after. So the induction of technological tools and scientific way of thinking, that needs to be imbibed across into the government. And I think there is no mechanism, because our scientists are cut off from the line ministries, and so do line ministries are unaware of what is happening in the country, the huge potential. And COVID really showed us how we did that. So I think it is important that NRF proactively engages with across the line ministries to help and enable them, whether it be food security or energy security or whatever it be, disaster management. We have a major role to play there. If NRF is smart enough to do that, there is enough fun in the system.
Thank you, Aurobindo. Poonam, 30 seconds. Aurobindo used our time up. 30 seconds.
Okay. So let me end by saying that much more CSR and funding from other sources are needed for STEM research to ensure that STEM-related research can yield maximum benefits for the people. However, both social science and STEM research have to be combined, relate to each other, of high quality. It has to be high quality. I'm reminded of Dr. Bhan, the late Dr. Bhan, who was Secretary DST, who talked about centers of excellence in India. And I'm glad you alluded to that in two-tier cities. But I want to end by saying that research has to not only be of high quality, it has to be independent, it has to be relevant, it has to be, and it must feed into decision making that can bring about improvements in people's lives at the end of the day.
Thank you, Poonam. Naushad, quick summary comment.
Sure. So three sentences. The first is keep it simple. Keep it simple with the full 50,000 crores of funding for NRF coming from the government. The government can afford it. If you look at the funding that's going into subsidies for example, a single semiconductor packaging plant in Gujarat, that's 17,000 crores. Here we're talking about 50,000 crores over 5 years. It's something we can. Second, focus it on academic researchers and back academic researchers. And third, ensure that the governance of the NRF is flexible enough, professional enough, intelligent enough, and out of bureaucrat control, such that it can actually make things work over time. We won't get it right day one. If structure in place, we can get it right over time.
Thank you, Naushad. Udayan, as a practicing researcher, the last word goes to you. You're muted, Udayan.
Thank you, Tarun. So I was thinking that, it has to be a decentralized, networked model. And so it has to be conversations, the ones that we're having now, coordination, right? And some sort of a networked coaching, right? In some sense, mentoring, I would say, which pulls everybody together, right? And I think that we need to think bottoms up as an important element of this as well. So I would stop here, and hopefully, we bet on individuals.
Okay, thank you for that. That last comment is a good summary comment. I mean, usually in policy interventions of this sort, there are large-scale and complicated environments, such as the represented by the promise and the diversity of India, you do need a little bit of top-down policy attention and framing and so on. And you certainly need a lot of grassroots experimentation. And as we've all said, we need various stakeholders in society to come together to do this, and to do this in a flexible and well-intentioned manner, and dare I say, an experimental manner, to allow this to essentially find our way to a solution over the next 5 to 10 years. But I want to end on a note of optimism again, that it's really terrific that thanks to the good offices of the government and the bureaucracy and various scientists and the efforts of literally dozens and dozens of academics and well-wishers over the last 10 to 15 years, NRF exists. And I'll join the audience in giving a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much for being with us on behalf of FAST and the Mittal Institute at Harvard. Have a good rest of the evening in India and the rest of the day wherever you are.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thanks.